Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar on the CDBG-DR 2018 and 2019 Federal Register Notice. My name is Jelani Newton, and I'll be your webinar host for today. Before we begin the session, I'll just mention a few brief housekeeping notes. Please note that all attendees will be muted throughout the session. Questions can be sent through the Q&A button on the webinar menu at the bottom of your screen. Presenters will be sending responses through the same Q&A panel, and time will also be reserved at the end of the session to address any questions that were not previously answered. The webinar is being recorded, and both the slides and the webinar will be made available on HUD Exchange after the session. And finally, when you disconnect from the webinar, you'll be prompted to complete a brief feedback survey. Please take a moment to tell us what you thought of the session. The feedback will help us to improve future trainings. With that, I'll turn it over to Jen Carpenter at HUD to begin our session.
All right, thanks, Jelani. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. We are going to dive into our recent Federal Register notice that we published at the end of January. It allocates funds for 2018 and 2019 disasters, and then also for additional unmet infrastructure needs for 2017 disasters. We know that this notice can be a little confusing. We know it's difficult when we have to rely on prior notices in the past to sort of follow along, and it requires, a lot of research on your part to go back to those old notices. So we really wanted to present it all in a complete document here in our slideshow, and my team will be walking you through all the waivers and alternative requirements that apply to that money that are in all those prior notices. So today we have Michaela Katani and Bonnie Newcomb from the HUD team. They're on our policy unit at the Disaster Recovery and Special Issues Division. I'm sure you've heard my name before, or my voice before. I'm Jen Carpenter, the Assistant Director of Policy for our policy unit at DRSI. So Bonnie and Michaela will be walking you through all the notice requirements, the waivers, grant process, certification, timelines, all that stuff from the notice. But right now we're going to turn it over to Marion McFadden, the Senior Vice President at Enterprise.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining. We're really excited that you're here today. In just a moment, we're actually going to do a poll to find out a little bit more about the audience. But before we get that started, I just wanted to give you a quick overview of the allocation that we're talking about today. So the grantees are receiving funds under one Federal Register notice, which is 85 FR 4681. Which is allocating $3.8 billion in CDBG-DR funds. And those funds came from two separate appropriations. The first is Public Law 115-254, and the second is Public Law 116-20. For your purposes, they're riding together in this notice, so it doesn't really matter among this group which appropriation you were funded for primarily. Let's go to the next slide, please. So here you can see an overview of the total allocations that have been provided by Congress under CDBG-DR for the presidentially declared major disasters occurring in 2017, 2018, and 2019. And that's for those disasters to which HUD has appropriated funding. In the slightly tan columns on the left-hand side, those are the funds that were made available and are governed by prior allocation notices in the Federal Register. For new grantees, in a few minutes, we're going to talk about why this is so important, so stay with me if you're not sure. And then on the right-hand side, you can see the allocations under the two separate public laws, and then the total combined allocations under all three of the laws for these 2017, 2018, and 2019 disasters. However, I said total, but the total actually excludes a couple of things. That's the almost $16 billion that was provided for mitigation and the $2 billion for electrical system improvements in Puerto Rico and the USVI. Those are governed by separate notices and so are not relevant here. Before we move along, we're going to get started with a poll to ask you some questions so that we can understand who's attending the webinar live. Jelani is going to pull up the questions and then you'll have the opportunity to answer. Our first question for you is, what type of organization do you represent? State government, local government, or other? And after each of these questions, Jelani will have the ability to give us, almost in real time, a breakdown of the answers. So please go ahead and answer now.
This is Jelani. We're going to leave this poll open for 10 more seconds. I see responses are still coming in.
Asking these questions is very helpful for us in understanding whether we have a lot of newbies coming in who are unfamiliar or whether we're primarily talking to folks who have been administering one or more CDBG-DR grants.
Okay, we're going to go ahead and close this poll and share the results. So we have 42% of respondents representing state government, 22% representing local government, and 35% representing a different another kind of organization.
Thanks, Jelani. We're going to move to the next question, which is, how is your organization receiving CDBG-DR funds? Are you a direct grantee? Are you a current or a potential sub-grantee? Other? Or is this not applicable because you don't expect to be receiving CDBG-DR funds?
Great, it looks like we've gotten most of the responses in. We'll give the poll 5 more seconds. Great. So we have 45% of respondents as a direct grantee, 15% as a current or potential sub-grantee, 12% as other, and 27% saying not applicable.
Thanks. Our next question for you is, in what year did the federally declared disaster or disasters in your community occur? There are some jurisdictions to whom Mother Nature was really unkind over 2017 through 2019. So if you had multiple declared disasters for which you're receiving funding here, you can select all that apply.
All right, looks like most of the responses are in. We're going to give it 5 more seconds. Great. All right. So 60% of folks selected 2017, 48% selected 2018, and 35% selected 2019. And we recognize that folks could select multiple choices, so there may be overlap there.
So we expect that we have a lot of new grantees joining us today, so let's test that out. So the next question is this your community's first CDBG-DR allocation? Please select yes, no, or not applicable.
Okay, looks like we've gotten most of the responses in. All right, we'll close the poll. and we have 38% for whom this is their first CDBG-DR allocation.
Okay, pretty high numbers given the many different CDBG-DR allocations that are out there at this point.
Mm-hmm.
And our last question for all of you goes to your personal experience. Is this the first CDBG-DR grant that you personally are supporting? Yes, no, or not applicable? Thank you.
Okay, we'll give it 5 more seconds. All right, so for 46% of respondents, this is the first grant that they're, CDBG-DR grant that they're supporting.
Terrific. So it turns out we do have a large number of new communities and individuals who are going through the first time. So I think that means that this is going to be a great use of time for all of you, as well as for those of you with more experience who are coming to new requirements through a new grant, or just are ready for a refresher on some of the key concepts of CDBG-DR. So we're going to do an overview of the waivers and the alternative requirements. And before I hand it off back to the HUD team, I'll give some tips for the new folks here. So the CDBG-DR 2018 and 2019 Federal Register Notice is so important because it imposes requirements of prior CDBG-DR Federal Register notices. It provides clarifications on waivers and alternative requirements that came before in prior notices, and it even amends prior notices by adding regulations that apply to local governments. So as Jen mentioned, it can be a confusing and kind of complex web of rules here. So we really appreciate folks making the time to listen today to start to build that base of understanding of what's different here and now. So here are my tips for new grantees. So I'm going to start and end in the same place, which is pay very close attention to what you read in the Federal Register. These notices are your rule book. They are your guidebook. In the regular CDBG program, you can read the regs, you can read the guidances, and have the same sense from year to year. But there are real differences among the grants, and so you have to continue to come back to the Federal Register notice. There is no way around it but through it, so keep your Federal Register notices close. Whether you're a person who likes to highlight or tab electronically or on paper, use your system because the Federal Register notices are so important. For those of you who've worked with CDBG-DR in the past, but haven't in recent cycles received CDBG-DR, you should expect some significant changes because the program has evolved over time. If you have never worked with CDBG-DR, but you're familiar with the annual CDBG-DR program, you're not just going to have to learn some new rules, but you're also going to have to unlearn some of the core rules that you've been used to. So for example, you'll find here that housing is prioritized under CDBG-DR. And new construction of housing is much more widely available as an eligible activity than it is under the regular annual CDBG-DR program. You're going to find an emphasis on planning and particularly taking into consideration future hazards. You're going to see an imposition of minimum affordable periods set by the federal government instead of set by yourselves. You're going to see some different provisions dealing with environmental review. And if you haven't been around in a while, you're going to see a different set of rules and updates around duplication of benefits. It's not going to make it any simpler than the last time you looked at it, but there are changes. So today we're going to give you an overview of the rules that are applicable for the grants from 2017, 2018, and 2019 disasters. And again, these rules are different in some areas from the rules for earlier grants. So please remember that when you talk to your counterparts from different jurisdictions who are operating under different program rules. talking with your counterparts can be an excellent way to understand what's possible under the program. And grantees have talked about the importance of making those connections. So I don't mean to discourage you in any way, but just to say, keep coming back to the rules that apply to your current grant. And of course, this means that the jurisdictions that have multiple CDBG-DR grants open, including many who are joining us today, have to constantly toggle between the different rules in different Federal Register notices in the administration of their programs. I really wish that HUD and the Congress could offer you a simpler set of rules, but the reality is that legally you're bound to comply with the rules that flow from each appropriation. So again, I encourage you to pay very close attention to the Federal Register notices and never hesitate to ask your DRSI rep for guidance in interpreting these rules when needed. HUD has substantially increased the number of staff who are available to support grantees as they've had an increasing number of appropriations, and you should take advantage of that. And then finally, before I hand it over, I just wanted to say on the human side, it may feel a bit overwhelming to navigate a patchwork of Federal Register notices, but you can do this. The HUD team is available to support you. And I'm saying this as someone who's worked with CDBG-DR grantees going all the way back to the first multi-billion-dollar CDBG-DR grants after 9/11. My best piece of advice is to read and reread the notices, watch the webinars, and keep asking questions until you have the confidence that you really understand what's expected of you. The work that you're tasked with, administering CDBG-DR, is some of the hardest and most meaningful work that you could possibly do for your community. And sometimes, as I'm sure you all already know, it can be very stressful. Understanding the rules is the best thing that you can do now to set yourself up for success in administration of the programs. With that, I'll hand it back over.
And with that, I think we're ready for the folks at HUD to pick up.
Jen, you may be muted.
I think we're turning it over to Michaela and Bonnie. Are you guys on the line? So, Jelani, it looks like they're talking, but we're not hearing them.
Okay, no worries. I can fix that.
Is it Bonnie's line?
Yep.
Apologies, everyone, for the technological snafu here.
Yes. Bonnie, I can see that your line is muted. Can you unmute it in the system? There we go. Good. Are you there, Bonnie?
To the computer audio. Can you guys hear us okay now?
Yes, now we can hear you. Yeah. Can you hear me, Michaela?
Okay. All right, it looks like everybody can hear us now. So we are gonna start back up. And Bonnie, do you wanna go ahead and start talking about our first allocation table?
Okay, so now we're going to briefly go over the allocations announced in the Federal Register and the key dates for you to know. Table 1 in the notice on page 85 FR 4682 of the Federal Register notice shows each allocation based on the disaster declaration number, which public law the funds are coming from, and the minimum amount that must be expended in the HUD identified most impacted and distressed areas. Each of the most impacted and distressed areas or mid areas are listed in the last column for each grantee. For grantees that have mid zip codes, you may include the entire county as a mid area to ease the administrative burden. This is just for the 2018 and 2019 disaster grants, not the 2017 infrastructure allocation. This slide shows the proportion of the allocation table for the additional unmet infrastructure needs from the 2017 disasters. Of the $431 million from Public Law 11620, $331,442,114 is for the grantees affected by Hurricane Maria. The grantees receiving this infrastructure allocation are the state of California, the state of Florida, the state of Georgia, the state of Missouri, the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico, and the U.S. Virgin Islands. This portion of the table shows the allocation impacted by the 2018 disasters. As you can see in the notice and on this slide, our impacted states, counties, and territories are the state of Alaska, American Samoa, the state of California, the state of Florida, state of Georgia, Hawaii and Kauai County, state of North Carolina and South Carolina, the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands, state of Texas, and the state of Wisconsin. Many of these grantees are familiar with the CDBG-DR grant, and for our new grantees, we look forward to working with you to assist you in your program launches. This portion of the allocation table shows unmet need impacted by the 2019 disasters. As you can see, our impacted states are the state of Arkansas, the state of Iowa, the state of Missouri, the state of Nebraska, the state of Ohio, the state of Oklahoma, and the state of Texas. Some important dates related to the 2018-2019 disaster grants to make note of are the Federal Register, which was published on January 27th, 2020, with an applicability date of February 3rd. This applicability date starts the clock for grantees to submit required items listed in the Federal Register. If you submitted your financial management and procurement certification for a 2016 or 2017 disaster, you may use those certifications for a 2018 or 2019 disaster grant. If you need to make updates or are submitting new certifications, they must be submitted to HUD no later than April 3rd. And an action plan must be submitted no later than June 2nd. For grantees receiving a grant from both 2018 and 2019 disaster, you will need to create 2 separate action plans per grant. We are working on posting the action plan checklist and certifications, so be on the lookout for those documents. It's also important for you to note that the public comment period for your action plans must be at least 30 days and displayed prominently on your official website. HUD will have a minimum 45-day review once your action plan has been formally submitted. As a reminder, please submit your action plans to disaster_recovery@hud.gov, copying your CPD specialist. Your first quarterly performance report, or QPR, will be due 30 days after the first full quarter after the grant agreement is signed. Like with previous CDBG-DR grants, your 2018-2019 disaster grants must be expended within 6 years. For our infrastructure allocation grantees, this slide shows the important dates for your substantial amendment to your current HUD-approved 2017 disaster action plan. Substantial amendments will be due within 90 days, including the 30-day public comment period. Infrastructure grantees must submit their action plan amendments no later than May 3rd, and HUD will have a 45-day review period for this substantial amendment to the action plan. The infrastructure funding is a new grant and will have a separate 6-year period from previous CDBG-DR grants. Now we will move into the grant administration process and action plan requirements. For our 2018 and 2019 grantees, the grant process follows the February 9th and August 14th Federal Register. You will need to develop or amend your existing citizen participation plan and actively consult with affected stakeholders. Again, a reminder is to submit or update, if needed, your certifications of financial controls, procurement processes, and grant management by April 3rd. You will need to submit an implementation plan and capacity assessment by April 3rd. And in addition, post your draft action plan for 30 days. After the end of your 30-day public comment period, you will need to respond to the comments and submit your comments and responses to HUD with your action plan, including projected expenditures and outcomes. You will also need to submit the standard Form 424 with your certifications. Once you have submitted your action plan, you will need to request access to the Disaster Recovery Grant Reporting System, or DRGR. Then you'll be able to enter the activities both before or after your submission of the action plan. But you must enter activities after the action plan has been approved and begin drawing down funds from DRGR within 180 days after the effective date in the notice. Once HUD has received your official submission of the action plan, HUD will have 45 days to review and either approve or disapprove the plan. If HUD disapproves the submitted action plan, you will be notified of the deficiencies within the plan, and you will need to resubmit the plan within 45 days. The Secretary will certify to the proficiency of each grantee's financial controls, procurement processes, and adequate procedures, and the implementation plan and capacity assessment. Once this is completed and the action plan is approved, HUD will send each grantee an approval letter followed by a grant agreement. Grantees will then sign and return the grant agreement, after which each grantee will need to publish the HUD-approved action plan on their official website. At this point, HUD will establish the line of credit for the grantee. Grantees will need to begin drafting policies and procedures for key programs and operations, or updating their current policies and procedures. These will need to be published on your official website. Grantees must enter the activities from its HUD-approved action plan into the DRGR system if it has not previously done so, and submit its DRGR action plan to HUD. Please note that funds can be drawn from the line of credit only for activities that are established in the DRGR system. Once the environmental review requirements are completed, the grantee may then begin drawing down funds. For infrastructure grantees, you will follow a similar process through a substantial amendment to your current HUD-approved action plan. For this substantial amendment, you will need to incorporate the funding allocated to you from Public Law 11620. As you are making this amendment to your action plan, you will need to follow the February 9th and August 14th Federal Registers. These registers will explain the requirements for infrastructure activities, as well as the steps to follow when making a substantial amendment. Once this amendment is submitted, HUD will have 45 days to review and approve or disapprove. If you need to update your financial controls and procurement certifications, you will need to do this by April 3rd. Additionally, for grantees who have entered into alternative procedures under 428, HUD is coordinating with FEMA to work out a timeline for when these will be reviewed and funds will be released. Now I'm going to turn the presentation over to Michaela Catani.
Thank you, Bonnie. So now we're going to talk about some of those pre-award steps that you guys are going to take before the action plan, and then we'll get into the waivers and alternative requirements. So in this presentation, we've mentioned certifications a lot, and the purpose of these certifications is to see if you are proficient in the items that are listed on this slide. So what's your proficiency in financial management and your controls, your procurement processes and standards? Do you have a duplication of benefits procedure, and is it adequate? Will you anticipate spending the funds in a timely manner? Will you be able to maintain a comprehensive disaster recovery website? And do you have procedures in place to detect and prevent fraud, waste, and abuse? Next, you will also have to certify that you have adequate management capacity. And so you will need to do two things. You will need to include how you will communicate timely with applications and their statuses, and then submit an implementation plan. And this plan is an assessment of your capacity, your staffing, your internal and interagency coordination, technical assistance, and accountability. And there is a staffing analysis worksheet in the launch toolkit on the HUD Exchange that you guys can download and use to help you analyze your capacity and your staffing. Because this notice has a lot of references to those other prior notices, we are going to cover the waivers and alternatives and additional requirements that are applicable here for this notice and these disaster grants. We start by defining the prior notices, starting with the 2017 disaster federal registers that were published on February 9th and August 14th. These notices are where the bulk of these waivers and alternatives come from. So later on when this presentation is posted, you can click the links here, or you can find each federal register through our website. We also reference the DOB Federal Register as well, and so that's another reference for you. Before we get into the waivers and requirements of the prior notices, I want to just mention what a waiver is and explain that. So when Congress appropriates CDBG-DR funds, Congress gives HUD the authority to waive certain regulations that require CDBG program that kind of amend what the regular CDBG program can operate from. And the purpose of these waivers is to help streamline the recovery process. So when HUD provides grantees with these waivers or alternatives, the things that we, the department, are looking at and evaluating on is if the waiver was made with good cause in mind. And we are also verifying to make sure that there isn't any inconsistencies with the waiver with any of the underlying purposes of the HCD Act. We also want to make sure that there's not any conflicts with our cross-cutting partner requirements. And then there are some areas where we cannot waive. And so those areas are things like equal opportunity, fair housing, environmental review requirements, and Davis-Bacon. So as we go through these waivers and alternatives, they're kind of grouped by a similar category. Some of them are kind of odd, and so they just don't quite fit. So the first round we're going to talk about is those administrative type waivers. As we've mentioned throughout the presentation, the public comment periods for your action plans and your substantial amendment is a 30-day period. So if you're one of our newer grantees or haven't had a DR grant in a while and you're starting with that February 9th notice, you'll see that the original public comment period is 14 days. That was amended in our August 14th Federal Register. So your requirement is 30 days. There is also an administrative cap of 5% and a planning cap of 15% for the total grant. Another difference that CDBG-DR has from the regular CDBG program is that states now have the authority to directly administer programs, and we have given that authority to help expedite the recovery process in any way that we can. So that is an option for any of our due state grantees. Additionally, you do have to meet the overall benefit requirement where 70% of your funds must be used to assist LMI individuals through the various LMI national objectives available to you guys. Most grantees should be relatively familiar with the term HUD identified most impacted and distressed areas, or our MIDs. So 80% of your funding that you receive must be spent in these areas. And when you're calculating to determine if an expenditure can be counted towards that 80% goal, remember that 80% of your admin expenditures will count as well. However, planning expenditures will only count if the grantee describes in your action plan how that planning activity will benefit the mid area. Moving into substantial amendment requirements. Substantial amendment criteria comes from the August 14th notice and has the following requirements. So at a minimum, a substantial amendment is triggered when there is a change in program benefit or beneficiary or eligibility, if there's an addition or a deletion of an activity, an allocation or reallocation of a monetary threshold specified by you, the grantee, which will need to be included in your action plan, or a change in that threshold that you establish. And so your thresholds could be a percentage or a number that is solely up to you to determine. And we do expect that substantial amendments and non-substantial amendments will occur in your action plan process as you define what the unmet needs are and determine how your unmet needs are changing. So we expect for you guys to be making amendments, and when you make amendments, they should be occurring chronologically, and you should post them where the entire plan is able to be viewed by the public or HUD at any point in time. If you guys are choosing to use the urgent need national objective, you just need to make sure that you are documenting how it is related and responding to the disaster impacts. And then just a little note, there's not a 24-month limit on using urgent need from the disasters, which is really helpful, especially for those 2018 disasters. Additionally, HUD may establish special grant conditions for each grantee in order to mitigate the risk of the award. And so those special grant conditions would come into play when HUD has approved your action plan and is sending along your grant agreement for you guys to sign. Now we're going to kind of move into those housing and construction related waivers and topics. So there is a housing priority, and this housing priority comes from the August 14th notice and states that you guys must primarily consider and address unmet housing need. However, you are able to address economic development and infrastructure if you can show that there is not any remaining housing need or that that housing need will be addressed by other sources of funding. And then for our grantees that are receiving that 2017 infrastructure allocation, those funds must be used for infrastructure. Affordability periods. So these were amended and updated in our August 14th notice and then mentioned again in this new notice. So I'm going to talk about those requirements a little bit and then follow up later on in the presentation about the clarifications that we've included. So affordability periods for multifamily rental units of 5 or more have a affordability period of 20 years. And then those rental properties with 8 or more units have an affordability period of 15 years. For new construction of single family homes, there is a 5-year affordability period. And note that this is clarified in the new notice to show that this is only for new construction with homes that are sold by the grantee or their subrecipients through a home ownership program. And then additionally on this slide, we mentioned those housing incentives. So these are eligible activities for you guys to incorporate into your plans and your proposed projects, but just make sure that you are showing why these incentives are necessary and reasonable. Moving along, we are going to talk briefly about buyouts and acquisitions. So a buyout is when you're acquiring a property that's in a floodway or a floodplain or a disaster risk zone, and you are trying to buy it out to get people out of the risk areas. So when you're participating in a buyout, that area cannot be redeveloped and must maintain open green space. Second homes are not eligible for rehabilitation or housing incentives, but may be eligible for buyouts. So if you're looking at buyouts, you may want to consider the second home option and include that in your action plans. And just to clarify, a second home is defined as a home that is not primary residence of an owner, a tenant, or any other occupant at the time of the disaster or at the time of application. Additionally, kind of in the same category is the use of eminent domain. So eminent domain may only be used when a project is for public use. And if you want more guidance and examples about this, check out the August Federal Register. Interim mortgage assistance can be extended to beneficiaries up to 20 months. So that's something that CDBG-DR dollars can be used for. What CDBG-DR dollars can't be used for, however, is to pay off those forced mortgages, and it cannot extend the standard emergency rental assistance. Additionally, there's also a prohibition on activities with private utilities. However, there are other energy-related activities that you could choose to pursue, such as public utilities or any other forms of green infrastructure. Moving into our cost requirements, grantees must do a cost price analysis to ensure that there's full and open competition. Grantees must describe their controls to determine what construction costs are reasonable, while also establishing some policies and procedures on how these cost effectiveness will be assessed for each proposed project in the action plan. Green building standards. So grantees must apply green building standards for replacements and new construction. There are a few different options that are listed in the register for you to choose from to help meet this requirement. And then once you do choose which requirements you want to follow, you should state these standards in your action plan. Now we're going to get into some of those environmental related requirements. So if a property with a combined household income greater than 120% area median income, or AMI, is located in the floodplain at the time of the disaster, and the property owner did not maintain flood insurance on the damaged property, CDBG-DR assistance may not be used to rehab or reconstruct the property. When elevating homes in a 100-year floodplain, elevation must be at least 2 feet above base flood elevation, or BFE. These same standards apply for those non-residential structures where there aren't any housing units or residents. So the elevation is still 2 feet above base flood elevation, and these structures can be elevated or flood-proofed. Grantees may also adopt federal agency environmental review without additional review or public comment. And if grantees are choosing to go this route and adopt another agency's review, you must notify HUD. In addition to adopting another federal agency's environmental review, there is also a HUD addendum to the FEMA programmatic agreement for Section 106, that historic preservation. So these are some options that you guys can use as grantees to help streamline your environmental review process. And then another option that you may find valuable is the option to tier your environmental reviews. And the benefit of tiering is to eliminate some of that repetition and focus on the actual issues at each level of your review. So for example, if you're a responsible entity looking to do a rehab program with similar activities all in one defined locality within a certain time frame, but you haven't specifically picked out your sites yet, tiering could be something valuable for you guys to use to streamline your process. CDBG-DR funds are prohibited from being used to enlarge a dam or levee beyond the original footprint, but you can still use DR funds for these activities just as long as you're not going beyond that footprint. If you're planning to use DR dollars, you are required to register with the U.S. Army Corps, National Levee Database, or National Inventory of Dams, ensure the structures are admitted to the appropriate programs and accredited under FEMA's NFIP program, entered into DRGR, and that you have documentation where you're showing how this risk reduction of this project is helping to reduce risk in those mid areas. Infrastructure planning and design is also really to make sure that your infrastructure projects are thought out and promote sound, sustainable recovery efforts that are informed by the disaster. So grantees should coordinate with their local and regional planning areas to ensure consistency across the board in all of the recovery efforts, and that funds are being aligned to maximize our investments in all recovery efforts. Moving into those economic revitalization topics. Grantees will continue to prioritize assisting small businesses, which is defined by SBA, or those businesses engaged in farming operations. Another facet of helping businesses recover after a disaster is working capital. So working capital is defined as assets minus current liabilities. Working capital can be the amount of cash needed to fund 1 year's worth of liabilities after subtracting other current assets like inventory or accounts receivable. Therefore, working capital excludes expenses for things like construction or expansion of the facilities. Additionally, if you are proposing a program to distribute funds to a for-profit entity, grantees and their subrecipients are required to comply with underwriting requirements and guidelines in Appendix A to 24 CFR Part 570, which you can find online. The use of CDBG-DR as match. So if you guys are planning to use DR funds as a match for FEMA's 428 projects, grantees must be able to document that the funds are used for actual costs incurred, costs that are eligible, the project is meeting a national objective, and any other CDBG requirements that are occurring. And then the department is actually currently working on writing some joint guidance in this topic to help alleviate any confusion on what your requirements are if you're using CDBG-DR as that non-federal match. So in the meantime, reach out to your CPD reps for assistance and clarity if you need guidance in this area. Duplication of benefits. So just to highlight on some basics of duplication of benefits, or DOB, this is a really important concept that you want to make sure that you're following correctly. And to prevent any duplication, grantees must use the best, most recent available data. And that can include things from FEMA, SBA, insurers, and any local, state, or any other funds that may become available to recover from the disaster. There should be a duplication of benefits analysis conducted for every entity or beneficiary that is receiving CDBG-DR funding. This means that you as the grantee will define and determine what the need is and what the duplication may be. It is important to know what is not considered a duplication, and exclude these items so that they will not reduce the beneficiary's CDBG-DR award. You don't want to underfund someone's needs, just as you don't want to overfund their needs. In June of 2019, HUD released a new DOB guidance that would be applicable to these 2018 and 2019 and 2017 as well CDBG-DR grants. If you haven't watched the webinar yet, I would really recommend that you watch it. It gives a really nice breakdown of that Federal Register and how the DRRA affects CDBG-DR grantees. In a nutshell, there have been some changes in the treatment of declined loans. So that includes SBA loans. And just to help you guys kind of understand some of this terminology, I'm gonna kind of define a few of the terms. So a subsidized loan, which includes forgivable loans and other private loans. So both FEMA and SBA offer these types of loans to aid in the recovery efforts post-disaster. And under this newer guidance, a subsidized loan is not considered duplicative, provided that all of the federal assistance is used towards the loss impacted by the disaster. A declined loan is a loan that was approved or offered by a lender in response to a loan application, but was then turned down by the applicant. This means that the applicant never signed the loan documents to receive the loan as a form of assistance. And then there's also canceled loans, which differ because the borrower has entered into an agreement, but for a variety of reasons, all or portion of the loan was not dispersed and is no longer available to the applicant. So neither of these would be considered a DOB. When a grantee is conducting a DOB analysis and comes across these undispersed loans for the same purpose, the grantee is required to notify the lender and obtain the applicant's agreement not to draw down on the loan funds without approval, and to determine that all of the federal assistance being awarded is being used towards a loss suffered from the qualifying disaster. Grantees may also choose to reimburse individuals or businesses for costs of CDBG-DR eligible activities paid with a subsidized loan. However, I would caution you when pursuing something like this, just to ensure that you are addressing all of your unmet need and pursuing all of these activities with cost reasonableness in mind. And then just as a reminder, CDBG-DR funds may not be used for any activities that are reimbursable or duplicative of FEMA or the U.S. Army Corps. So make sure that you are aware and you're doing your due diligence to see if other sources of funding are available for that particular activity that you're looking to pursue post-disaster. So now we're going to talk about the new waivers and additional requirements and some clarifications that are found in this notice. This one's kind of an easy one. So our prior notices, we only had state grantees. So we are extending all of the waivers and alternatives from these prior notices to our local government grantees. And that will include things like the action plan requirements, citizen participation, use of urgent need, and procurements. HUD has established a waiver that will allow grantees with a 2015, 16, 17, or future grant to use up to 5% administrative and program income regardless of the original disaster allocation. The next waiver is specific to North and South Carolina. So for these guys, funds may be used interchangeably for the same activities in their mid areas related to Hurricane Florence and Hurricane Matthew recovery efforts. However, if there's any changes in the beneficiaries, they'll just need to make sure to include that information in their substantial amendment to their action plan. Additionally, your consolidated action plan requirements are also temporarily waived. So grantees are encouraged to incorporate disaster-related needs as soon as practical. Disaster-related needs must be incorporated into the grantee's next consolidation plan no later than fiscal year 2020 for the disasters occurring in 2017 and fiscal year 2022 for disasters occurring in the 2018 or 2019 fiscal year. The one-for-one replacement waiver is being extended in this notice to alleviate administrative burden. So if you are a new grantee with a 2018 or 2019 grant, you are automatically covered under this waiver. And then for those grantees that have a previous CDBG-DR grant that are also getting a DR grant under this notice, you have the option to choose which requirements you would like to follow to best help with your recovery needs. As I mentioned earlier, this affordability periods were amended in the August 14th notice and then clarified here in this notice. And the purpose of that clarification is to show that the intent to establish a 5-year affordability period for the single family units is not when the beneficiary owned and occupied the unit that is damaged by the disaster and is now receiving assistance. So this is purely when the grantee is using some sort of single family construction homeownership program to expand the housing stock, and not when a grantee is just using replacements, rehabs, and things like that for homeowners that are experiencing damage by the disaster. We also included a clarification here to the February 9th notice that describes how grantees can carry out property acquisitions for a variety of purposes, including buyout programs in disaster risk reduction areas. And so there's an additional paragraph that's added to the February 9th language, which includes wildfire disasters. And in this clarification, HUD is really just encouraging our grantees to carry out acquisitions to assist in any fire reduction management, but also to promote an increase in hazard insurance coverage in those wildfire risk areas. And then similar to the one-for-one waiver, this waiver is being extended to alleviate some of that administrative burden. Once again, if you are a new grantee under the 2018 or 2019 grants, you are covered under this waiver. And then those grantees that have a previous disaster grant that are also getting a CDBG-DR grant under this waiver, you have the option to choose which requirements that you would like to follow. And this waiver really just simplifies the administration of your proposed programs and projects, because likely they won't begin commencing until more than a year after the declared disaster, and a majority of those displaced persons will have returned to their dwellings or found other places to permanently reside. And then just to note that the waiver doesn't apply to those individuals that meet the occupancy requirements to receive replacement housing payment under URA, or those that are displaced or relocated temporarily due to your programs and projects. Procurement and subrecipients. So this clarification was included in the notice to emphasize that states have the option to choose one of the 3 options on the slide when developing your procurement policies and procedures, as well as those requirements for any local governments and subrecipients. So state grantees can choose to either adopt 2 CFR 200, 318 through 326 for itself and others, The grantee could choose to follow its state procurement policies and procedures and establish requirements for subrecipients and others, or could choose to adopt 2 CFR 200-317, meaning that it will follow its state's procurement policies and impose 2 CFR 200-318 through 326 onto its subrecipients. So all procurement policies need to ensure that there is full and open competition and that a cost or price analysis was conducted during any procurements that you do. Moving along, we have included some resources that might be helpful tools to assist you in launching your program. So if you go onto the HUD Exchange website, you'll find that there's a variety of resources available to you. In particular, there is a CDBG-DR launch toolkit, and that toolkit highlights an introduction to a CDBG-DR program and the life cycle of the grant, how to draft and publish action plans, preparing to expand your operations, executing data sharing agreements, and any other information that might be helpful as you get started. And then here on this slide is also the link to our Duplication of Benefits webinar from 2019. So now we will move into questions.
Hi, folks. We've got a lot of questions in the queue here that I want to answer. So thank you for submitting the questions, and thanks to Marion and Michaela and Bonnie for covering a lot of information in a short period of time. Our first question is, I'll just read it and then give you guys the answer. The disaster that resulted in our allocation has 12 counties and 3 regions of the state that were presidentially declared. However, our DR allocation was based on the mid of
bear with us as we're collecting our questions.
Hi, folks. Can you hear me now?
Yep, we can hear you fine, Jen.
Okay. All right, I'm going to go to this next question. Sorry, I think maybe Michaela and Bonnie are having problems hearing. So let me just finish this question. So they have an allocation where 12 of their counties were presidentially declared. But their mid allocation for HUD was just one single county. So they're asking, do we have to do our citizen participation planning process to include the larger geography, or can they focus solely on the HUD identified mid-zip county? That's really up to you and your citizen participation plan. So you want to always look to your citizen participation plan and how you've updated it for disaster recovery. Our notice requires that you make sure that all affected citizens and local governments are aware of your action plan and know what's happening. So that's really our requirement. So I would say it's up to you and, you know, how you're going to expand reaching out to citizens and doing public hearings, if that's part of your plan. I would also say for the 20% of your funds where the grantee defines their mid area, you might, you know, expand the HUD mid area. If it's one single county, you might expand that for your own mid area for that 20% of your allocation. So just something to consider. All right, we're asked to clarify what the official definition for a second home is. It's asking about a home attached to a primary home. So we have tried to make this a little simpler in the past. Notices we relied on the IRS definition. We didn't know if that that was the most clear for everyone. So instead, we've now defined it in our notices, and it's basically that a second home is not someone's primary residence, either at the time of the disaster or at the time of application. So if it's no one's primary residence, then we consider it a second home. But if you have someone who, maybe it's a family member and they're leasing that property and it is their primary residence and they can prove it, we would not consider that a second home. If you're renting to just someone, a tenant, and they can show that it's their primary residence, it's not a second home. So really, you're proving that this has a primary resident in it, living in it, and then that's how we show it's not a second home. So we have a question about affordability periods. They're asking what's the affordability period for rentals with less than 5 units. So other than the affordability periods Michaela went through in this slide, we don't have any more affordability periods. For us, that's kind of a new approach, just a way to sort of secure affordable housing for the future, that we're doing it for these larger units and multifamilies. So the ones we have on the slide are the only affordability periods we have. All right, someone's asking about the 2013 green building checklist. I'm assuming they mean the retrofit checklist. Is this still applicable? And yes, it is still applicable. You are required to use it for rehab of non-substantially damaged residential buildings. The checklist, just a note on the checklist, we have updated to allow for exceptions based on climate and geographic conditions as we work with some of our grantees that have these very specific conditions based on their climate, where certain materials might not make sense and that are included in that checklist. We can do exceptions. Excuse me. We can do exceptions to that. So if because of climate or geography you're finding that there are problems with that checklist and meeting those requirements, that it doesn't make sense, you can provide alternatives. Take that to your grant rep, talk to them about it, and we can go through that process. We work with our partners in the Office of Environment and Energy to review any alternatives that you would propose for that checklist. So are individuals and households located within the 100-year floodplain that did not maintain flood insurance eligible for a buyout, acquisition, and housing incentives? So Michaela mentioned the new prohibition we have on folks who are 120% above area median income and are in a floodplain and did not maintain insurance. Our notice specifically says they are not eligible for rehab or reconstruction assistance, so it does not preclude you from doing a buyout for those folks. And then just more clarification on this prohibition. Someone's asking, are they ineligible even if they had never received federal recovery assistance before? And yes, so if they meet those requirements, that they're above 120% of area median income, they did not maintain flood insurance, they cannot get a rehab and reconstruction award with these DR funds. And really, it's just a way to try to focus these funds on lower income individuals and households who really are in a place to not be able to afford insurance, because we know how expensive insurance is getting for everyone. And so we really just want, with the limited resources we have, we want folks to be focusing on those low income households. We have a question on match. Is match only for 428 projects or for public assistance match in general? Yes, you can use CDBG-DR is one of the only federal sources of assistance that you can use for these non-federal match requirements in FEMA. So it's, you know, regardless of the program, you can use it. I know they range from anywhere from 10% to 25% of those match requirements. So you can use our funds. Just keep in mind, reiterating, you know, to use DR as a match, you know, it doesn't take away that it's still CDBG-DR, and all the requirements that come with that still come, you know, to your programs that you're using the DR funds on. And so to the extent that something's eligible for FEMA dollars in the PA program, if it's not eligible for DR, you won't be able to use the DR match. So you just want to make sure you're looking at the programs, you're providing the match on, making sure they're eligible, making sure they meet a national objective, bringing in all the requirements like Davis-Bacon, labor wage rates, that kind of thing that apply to the DR funds. Another question on match, can the DR funds be used to match the local share of FEMA HMGP? And yes, again, you can use our funds for the match for any of those FEMA programs as long as it's eligible. We have a question about the Matthew and Florence provisions, and they're asking, must the activity show a tieback to the respective storm, or can funds for either grant be used for storm tieback to either storm? Yeah, it's a little bit of a confusing provision. So basically we're saying that those grants can be used interchangeably, which means as long as you're showing tieback to one of the storms, you're fine. So you have to show tieback to either Matthew or Florence. All right, we have an additional question. I think it's on DOB, and they're asking about the period of availability when we're talking about duplication of benefits. So I think Michaela did a pretty good job of explaining this, but it can be kind of confusing because SBA uses terms on these loans differently than HUD does. So I think sometimes it's just gets a little confusing. But just to be clear on what HUD defines, we define two different types of loans, right? A declined loan and a canceled loan. So a declined loan is when the applicant applied for the SBA assistance but never signed the loan documents, even though they were approved for the loan. So SBA said, yes, you can have this $20,000 loan for housing rehab, but the applicant, for whatever reason, decided not to sign that paperwork, did not accept the loan. In the past, we have required grantees to do a little bit of work to show why that wasn't a duplication of benefits, and basically just show why the person declined the loan in the first place. But that has been removed. That is no longer active for this set of grantees. If it's a declined loan, they never signed the paperwork, you can not include that in your duplication of benefits analysis. That is not a duplication. Then we have canceled loans, where an applicant signs a loan document and let's say takes out a portion of the loan. So they have a $20,000 loan for rehab. They get a $10,000 payment for that. And then they call SBA and say, you know what, I changed my mind. I don't want this loan. I'm going to not draw any more funds. I want to cancel it. Well, SBA has told us that even when this is the case and someone stops drawing down a loan, it's really not officially expired. It's not officially closed really to them. If they wanted to come back 6 months or a year from now and actually draw the money down, that they could do that if they reinstated that loan. So just to ensure that doesn't happen, you have to have this agreement with the beneficiary that says, I have canceled this loan, I will not be drawing it down. And, you know, you also, as the grantee, have to let SBA know that the beneficiary is signing this agreement to get DR funds and that they have agreed to not draw down that loan. In that case, any funds that were drawn are not a duplication if they were used for a disaster-related loss. So the applicant, the beneficiary, has to show that that initial amount of funds that they got were used for a disaster-related loss. From what we understand, SBA has pretty good requirements on maintaining paperwork to get additional funds from SBA to draw down that loan. So they should have that paperwork to show you that, yes, I use this money for the right purpose. Here's my documentation. So that's the case with the canceled loan. So when we're talking about those agreements, it's really between the grantee and the beneficiary, and just making sure you're notifying SBA that that loan won't be drawn down anymore. So someone's asking, what about reduced loans? I'm not sure about that. I think, again, our notice says that if any funds that were drawn, as long as they were used for a disaster-related purpose, they're not a duplication of benefits. It also says, so even in the case of a reduced loan, it might be kind of similar. If they got a loan for $100,000, used $50,000, or decided not to use the other 50, and basically just called it quits with SBA and said, okay, 50,000 is my loan amount. In that case, again, it's really the same structure. So for the 50,000 that they already have drawn down to be counted, to not count against them in the duplication of benefits analysis, you have to show that it was used, that 50,000 was used for disaster-related loss. And then they have to have paperwork and notify SBA that they're getting this DR money and that they will not, you know, reinstate their loan because they're taking to DR to fulfill their remaining unmet needs. All right, I think that is all the questions we have. I'm trying to see, we have some coming into the chat, but I think, oh, there's a question on where can recipients find assistance on energy expertise that they would like to incorporate in their action plan? That's a good question. I think that's something maybe we can provide some resources to you in the future. Where for all our DR grantees, we want to make a pitch for our CDBG-DR problem solving clinic. We're hoping that we will have our partners from DOE at that clinic. So we'll have some of that expertise, I hope, to offer to our grantees. And at the very least, we are having those conversations with those folks. So we can definitely get some resources and start, you know, adding some of that onto the HUD exchange for folks in the future. But that's a good note for us to think about as we move forward. And I think that's all our questions. So we really appreciate everyone being on today and for taking this all in. It is a lot. HUD is doing, we're doing some one-on-one visits for our brand new CDBG-DR grantees to really walk through all these requirements, because we know, you know, it's a bit like, you know, doing that research to go backwards to those notices is not ideal. We're also hopeful, I'm going to say this on this webinar so everyone can hold me to it, we're going to issue what we're calling a consolidated notice for guidance for grantees that really puts all these requirements into one document. So look for that soon, and that'll be a lot. That'll help a lot with trying to put all these requirements together.